Hello and welcome to PhDear Diary. I am Andy Salkeld and this is my video blog during my PhD at Leeds Beckett University. I am studying psychology and particularly on the impact organisations have at a psychological level. This is, I think I'm coming up to like week 6 or week 7. I'm beginning to lose track of time. So I'm not quite sure where we are, but I am getting a lot closer to where I want to be in kind of understanding my question, understanding what I'm interested in and where I'm going to go with this research. And it's been a kind of long journey. The people who have been following along and who have watched the previous episodes will kind of know that it's gone through ups and downs, pivots, etc. But I am kind of getting towards where I want to be. So last week I talked about the competing values framework and how this basically models a business along 2 axes and how it's kind of whether you're internally or externally focused, and whether you're kind of stable or willing to change, and so on. I can't remember the exact terms of it. And basically what I've been trying to do is to connect the things I care about. And the things I care about, the things that matter to me in this, are what are the individual psychological outcomes resulting from organisations. Now, individual psychological outcomes that I care about are particularly with regards to work are what is the kind of mental health impact towards a person? Are people becoming more anxious, more depressed, etc., within a work environment as a result of work? Are people suffering from burnout more than ever? Another psychological impact. And these are all kind of married in with stress. And stress is kind of the state of being that kind of result in this. And if people are suffering from prolonged stress more, then it can have an impact, a prolonged psychological impact as a result. But then there's also other connections that I kind of made this week where actually, because I'm interested in financing and how finance plays a role in all of this. One of the things that I want to look at is job insecurity. And I hadn't even come across this term until the start of the week, but it feels incredibly important because what finance does, or the way finance operates within a business, is finance is what provides people with security, what provides them with stability. So the more you are the more financially stable an organisation and the more certain financing is, then there will be less of an impact on the other parts of an organisation and therefore less of an impact on an individual. So, key thing here, if a business is financially struggling, you would expect it to make more kind of shrewd financial decisions. You would expect it to, and the people in charge to prioritize the financing and survival of the business rather than individual level outcomes and so on, because financial survivability, etc. And therefore, that would impact the leadership, one of the aspects that I want to consider. It would impact the structure, because it would probably result from being less organic and become more mechanistic, because it has to make sure it's doing everything precisely and so on. There would be organic elements connected to it about how all the parts interact with with each other, but ultimately it would need to become leaner and more efficient if it is wanting to survive financially. These 2 parts in turn would lead to a different culture and a different climate within the organisation and how they all interact. And therefore those as a kind of holistic 4 pieces would feed down to an individual. And at the individual, where there is kind of financial stress in an organisation, we would expect individual stress to result from that. And there will be individual factors that mediate and moderate this, so their proximity to the finance team and things like that. Then there would also be they would be working harder, longer, etc., under worse conditions, potentially, and therefore burnout would be higher. We could expect there to be an increased instance of anxiety, depression, and so on. And then, like job satisfaction could decrease, and job insecurity would increase because they are uncertain of whether their job would continue, but also whether if the job does continue, will it be in the same state as it currently is in, and so on. And so that's just a bit of an example of how all these things can interplay together. And what I've been doing this week is I've been looking at can I measure those 4 big components of an organisation through a single model, which is the competing values framework. And 3 of them, there have been studies that have attempted to do this. So I talked about climate and culture last week, and how there were ways of measuring where climates and cultures fit within the competing values framework. Then I found out there's leadership has been connected to it. There's there's 8 leadership styles that are broadly connected into the 4 quadrants, 2 per quadrant. And if you see where the predominant leadership style is, you can see, okay, well, that's mostly in this quadrant, etc. And then the structural side of things, the organic versus mechanistic. Now, this one isn't necessarily broken down into the competing values framework, but it makes sense by simply looking along the diagonal, whereas more mechanistic organizations will obviously be internally focused and process driven, where they are okay, well, we're just going to do the same thing, we're going to repeat it, and we're going to get incredibly efficient at doing it. They'll be in the bureaucratic spectrum where we have the process, we do the process, and we do it well. And then at the other side, there will be very much a well, we are focused on adapting to the environment and changing, and we thrive in innovation and growing that way, and hence external and change orientated, so on. And this way, it you can see it just fits neatly along the diagonal, not necessarily being a specific part of the competing values framework. So I started doing that, and I'm fairly comfortable with how I'm going to fit those together. I found some nice measures that will allow, I will need to simplify and restrict them a bit, because asking 80 questions to work out climate is too much. I'd like to understand it, but 80 questions is a lot to ask people to do, and a lot to ask people to do in quick succession, and so on. So that's one part. Then I've got so then I started looking at how I'm going to measure the individual psychological impact. And so I looked at measures of burnout, and there's a very common scale of about 20 questions to measure burnout across 3 dimensions, which is good. There is a couple of measures of job security. One which favours quantitative job security, so that is whether your job exists or doesn't exist. So that's the pure loss of job. And then qualitative impact of job security. So that is where you are concerned that the actual quality of your job will deteriorate. whether it will not be the same job you are doing now in the future. So I think that's a very important impact, a very important delineation as well. There's models of stress, and I think again because I'm interested in individual psychological impact, I'm more focused on the perceived stress at work rather than physical stress. So the actual physical response, kind of the galvanic skin response and everything like that. But that's not to say I won't measure it. It's just I want a start for 10 that's kind of easy to do. Hello, Pika. So I'm just trying to make sure I get all those things together. And then I think I'm going to include like the general health questionnaire. So this is just, and probably just the 12-part one. And this just, as it says, measures general health. And it's kind of focused towards the mental health aspect of things. And the reason I want to do this is I was thinking of whether I include the clinical measures, but I'm not sure doing the clinical measures I'm not sure whether trying to actually connect the organisation through to an individual diagnosis is the way I want to go. I'm more looking at what's going to how it influences it rather than what are the determinants or determined features of. And then I know I've talked about stigma a lot in the past and how stigma works and how stigma will likely change, but stigma as an attitude and also behaviours and cognitions, but stigma as stigma as a concept, I don't know how easy it will be to connect through. So that might be something I look at towards the end of the PhD as an almost additional part to say, well, okay, we've seen how financing and other organisational parts result in individual psychological outcomes. Now that we've got the general big picture stuff, and then we experimentally test it, then we can look at, okay, well, we know how this happens, but what about attitudes? What about how people think, feel, and act as a result of it towards mental health? Because if we can show that, as an example, and this is not proven, if we can show that financing, so bad financing or transactional financing, things that kind of increase pressure, if we can show that has a negative impact on the mental health of people, and then we can also show that then if we consider how it also impacts attitudes towards mental health, you could end up with a kind of where not only does it, I'm trying to think of the word, there's a word that that has gone from my head. It's basically if we show that one increases kind of the negative psychological impact of individuals, but alongside that, it also shows that people are becoming more stigmatic towards negative psychological impacted individuals, you almost end up with this kind of it's a pressure cooker where people are struggling and people are not supportive of people struggling, and therefore it just gets worse and worse and worse. And that, I think that's worthwhile to consider, but I think we need to understand the actual individual level impact before we then go on to look at how attitudes towards those impacted are. You will see Pika wandering around in the background over here somewhere. Nope, she's by my feet now. Never mind. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming to with it, and I'm actually happy with the way it's coming together. my concern is, am I still leaving it too broad, or or is it getting suitably narrow? I had a discussion with my supervisor on Tuesday where we didn't do anything specific, but I actually felt confident talking about what I was talking about and so on. And he reassured me that I am doing everything right. I am approaching things in the right way, and that I am not falling behind, etc., which is a good thing. It's very much what I fear all the time. And I explained that actually where I want to get to at the end, so once we've done these kind of bigger conceptual linkage between all these different parts, is develop almost a tool to help organizations assess their psychological impact on their employees. And I believe I said this last week, one of the few things that organizations have very little control over, they can influence, and that they don't necessarily understand, is how employees perceive the organization, what is being perceived, because you can do something and you can implement change, but you can't change people's perceptions of the change unless kind of wider things happen around it. So it's a complex area that organizations have very little control over, and giving them a way to actually just consider perceptions of what they're doing. So giving them a way to say, okay, well, how is our leadership perceived? How is our structure perceived? How is our culture and our climate perceived? And then how is our financial position and performance perceived? Because when they can start seeing that, not only is it what is the objective, they also get the subjective, and therefore they can start seeing how to make differences and so on. And this is where we circle back to what I was talking about at the beginning of this series in subjective norms, because potentially what you can do is you can look at normative messaging as a way to show, well, actually, here's a way to change perception, and that may be a way organizations can and I always dislike the term intervention, but intervene into a problematic situation. They can potentially address things. So that's where I'm at. And just this morning, I found 2 fascinating yet terrifying papers that have looked at the impact of mergers and acquisitions on mental health. And these are kind of 2021 literature, so very new, and it is fairly consistent that and just the first sentence kind of says it all. Mergers and acquisitions are the bane of the employee's mental health. And it really hit home to me as someone who has worked in mergers and acquisitions, as someone who has spent 10 to 15 years in that field. Suddenly I'm like, actually, this makes a lot of sense now. And I know I started studying psychology to understand what happened to myself when I went through kind of my breakdowns and my suicidal ideation and everything like that. I know that's why I started this, but to actually see it in literature showing that, and I believe, I'm just trying to remember it, but I think it was like how death and death from suicide increased by 31 and 42% respectively post M&A in the 3 years after a transaction completes, is kind of scary that is actually what they found. Now, obviously, this is in their population, which I believe was either Sweden or the Netherlands, because they have fully government kind of implemented databases around all these aspects. So it's fascinating to see that is actually what it is. Now, this is transactional finance. So this is mergers and acquisitions, probably restructuring, probably buyouts, buy-ins, etc., etc. So all that sort of aspects of it. And it also showed it showed kind of diagnosis of depression, anxiety. It showed increased use in medication. It showed like decrease in job satisfaction, increase in burnout, all these sorts of things. Now, that gives me a lot of confidence to know that actually I'm on the right track. Now, whilst this is transactional and very much like here is an event, I'm kind of interested in, well, what about the ongoing financing? Because one of the things they found is that after 3 years of a transaction, so transaction happens 3 years later, once you do that, after the 3 years, everything returns back to the previous transaction levels. And that kind of makes sense because you adjust to the new climate, the new culture, the new leadership, the new structure that are all put in place, and then that becomes your new norm, as we are learning in the light of COVID. Now, where this gets really interesting is where you start looking at pure private equity, where you end up going through like 2, 3, 4, 5 multiple leverage buyouts, because private equity typically has a 3 to 5 year investment horizon. So what that typically means is a private equity firm invests, and then 3 to 5 years later, it sells its stake to make its money back and make profit on it. Great, that's the idea of the way it works. But from a mental health perspective, because it's shown after 3 years, this is where it returns back to normal. If you go from leverage buyout to leverage buyout to leverage buyout to leverage buyout, you never break that cycle. You never break out of the 3-year worsened mental health period. And that's where it would get really fascinating to look at, well, actually, what is going on in those businesses? Because in those businesses, where it is a large kind of life-changing event every 3 years, could we do a longitudinal study along one of those businesses and then see how that impacts at the individual psychological level? Because that would kind of give us an idea of it would give us more of a consistent view across whether that 3-year horizon that was found in the paper is actually true. Are there ways to adjust it? Because it could be that leadership could mediate the effect and so on. And so that's one fascinating avenue to go down. But obviously, I'm also interested in the more static, the more kind of understood day-to-day financing. So where the financing of an organization is stable, where it is just revenue generation, are there better revenue models for the individuals or for individual psychological outcomes? Now, again, I've not found literature on this yet, but my thought is where you have subscription-led models, revenue models, so consistent money is coming in every day, every week, every month, so that you can accurately predict your future levels of finance throughout an entire year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. When you have that level of consistency and certainty, I believe that will create a affectionately called mentally healthy culture, and the individual level outcomes will be diminished. But I can't find anything on that, which means I'm actually looking at something new, which is great, because that is what a PhD is meant to do. We look at something new and we consider new avenues of thought, and it will be very interesting to try to pick away at that. So that's kind of where I am with a lot of it. I know as I'm saying this, it feels like I've not come that far on, but actually what I've done over time is I've now refined it, and I'm getting it down. I'm trying to get it down to a sentence, and I think I know the beginning part of the sentence, or the beginning of my thesis title, which is very much organizations and individual psychological outcomes, because that is very much what I'm interested in. It's not just organizational finance, because I think if I look at that only, then I don't get to look at culture and climate and the ways it shapes individual outcomes. But I also don't want to say every little part of it, because it might change. It might kind of move and flow as things go on. As we find data, we can then say, oh, well, this bit and this bit. And I think that's where I'm starting. And I'm getting more excited about it, which is good, because this is going to be 3, 4, 5 years of my life, and I'm actually feeling excited about the research I'm about to do, because I'm getting the shape of it, and it's meaty enough that there will be enough for me to tackle over this time, but it's also not a sprawling monstrosity that it was kind of 6 weeks ago when I started this process. So I'm happy with it, and how it's taking shape. So I've kind of sent a lot of this over to my supervisor now to say, hey, look, this is kind of where I'm going. Do you think this title sounds right? Do you think this is the right way to go? Etc. etc. So it's all's good there. And yeah, I am more comfortable with where it is than where I have been previously. Now, what I might need to do is add in some more individual psychological measures, because then I'm kind of looking at more factors of it. I may need to consider other parts within an organisation. I may need to look at different sorts of financing. But I am slowly narrowing it down into this band of finance to the organisation to the individual, and that's the straight line. How financing changes an organisation and how an organisation impacts an individual. If I can connect all those through, then I've got a theoretical model upon which I can build and test multiple different parts of it. And that's an exciting place to be. That's actually quite cool. And it's one of the reasons I do this, because I think when I started this, I said one of the main reasons I wanted to do this is if I can articulate what I'm doing to you, to myself, to whoever's watching this, if I can articulate that, then I am consolidating the knowledge I have gained. And to me, that means a lot, because that's what this is. It's knowledge creation. And this is kind of the first time that I've actually felt I have successfully consolidated everything I've read over the past 6-7 weeks into a single sentence of what I want to do. So I'm pleased with that. Outside of the PhD, life is life. It's relatively quiet. I am still pushing as high as I can in World of Warcraft Mythic Plus. I am like I'm wanting to hit 3,000 rating, but that might well be challenging. Probably gets a lot easier next week, but we will see. And then still watching the Race for World First. It is taking a long time. They're progressing Anduin, and then 3 more bosses thereafter. So it's lasted a lot longer, but come Tuesday, Wednesday, they get double legendary, so it's probably going to end next week, which is good. Like, it's nice that it's lasted longer than one reset, let's put it that way. Seeing various friends this weekend and just basically staying chill whilst trying to just slowly move every little bit forward. And yeah, genuinely positive place. I have spoken to my doctor. I am lowering my medication on metazapine from 45 milligrams to 30 milligrams. So that should start in a couple of weeks. So you may well witness me deteriorating as I adapt to a new antidepressant, but we'll see how that goes. Everything else is pretty calm. Pika has some new boxes that she's enjoying, and I'm continuing to get back on with going to the gym, running and exercising. So all in all, it's very positive, and I am glad to have been able to share this with you. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next week. Oop, wrong mouse. Never mind. Thank you very much. Take care.